You look thirsty. The gold-drenched ballroom of the Ashford estate drips with excess, masking a family on the brink of financial ruin. Isabella Valori stands quietly near a pillar, her stained green gown and stoic dignity setting her apart from the loud arrogance of the crowd. Though she appears to be an uninvited guest, Isabella is actually the silent gatekeeper for her father, Alessandro Valori, sent tonight to decide the fate of the Ashfords' legacy. The evening celebration shatters when Preston Ashford approaches with a bottle of vintage wine. In a drunk display of power, he empties the bottle over Isabella's head as the room falls into a gasp of shock. Instead of intervening, his mother Arabella claps and records the cruelty for entertainment, while his father Sterling laughs at the spectacle. They are oblivious to the fact that by humiliating the silent partner, holding their $500 million future, they have just provoked a man who radiates deadly authority. Before we dive into this story, tell me where in the world you're watching from in time. I want to know how far this love story traveled. Drop your country in the comments, hit that subscribe button. I read every single one comment here, so please drop your comments now. Let's begin. The Ashford estate sat upon the hill like a fortress of limestone and light, a beacon of old money that had illuminated the social hierarchy of the coast for 3 generations. Inside the grand ballroom, the air smelled of white lilies and suffocating desperation. To the 300 guests sipping vintage champagne, the evening was a celebration of legacy, a dazzling display of the Ashford endurance. But to Sterling Ashford, it was a funeral for his dignity, dressed up as a gala. He stood near the entrance, a frozen smile plastered beneath his mustache, gripping his wife's arm with bruising force. "Stop fidgeting," Arabella Ashford hissed through her teeth, waving affectionately at a senator's wife. "You look like you're waiting for an executioner." "I am," Sterling murmured, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors. "If the Valori Group representative doesn't sign the merger by midnight, the bank sees everything. The house, the cars, the company. We'll be on the street, Arabella." The Ashfords were drowning. They were millions of dollars in debt, a secret kept behind high walls and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. The family business, once a titan of industry, was now a hollow shell kept afloat by creative accounting and pure denial. Tonight was their Hail Mary. The Valori Group, a mysterious private equity firm with limitless capital, had expressed interest in a partnership. A $500 million lifeline that would erase their sins and keep the Ashford name in lights. Sterling wiped a bead of cold sweat from his temple. He didn't know who the Valori representative was, only that they were already inside, watching, vetting, judging. He scanned the room, looking for older men in expensive suits, potential sharks circling the water. In his panic, he completely ignored the young woman standing silently in the shadow of a marble pillar. Isabella Valori swirled the sparkling water in her glass, her back against the cool stone. She wore an emerald green gown that draped over her frame like liquid envy, elegant but understated compared to the garish sequins surrounding her. She wasn't drinking. She was working. As the anonymous representative for her father, Alessandro, she was the invisible scale upon which the Ashford fate was currently being weighed. Her dark eyes missed nothing. She saw the fraying cuff on the waiter's uniform, a sign of cut corners. She saw the frantic, pill-induced brightness in Arabella's eyes. She saw the way Sterling checked his phone every 30 seconds, terrified of a call from his creditors. Desperation has a scent, her father had told her before she left. It smells like expensive perfume trying to cover the rot. Isabella took a small sip of water. She had read the financials. She knew about the offshore loans and the unpaid vendors. But her father was interested in the infrastructure, not the management. He needed a clean front for his legitimate investments, and the Ashford name, despite its hidden tarnish, still carried weight in the daylight world. Isabella was here to answer one question: could these people be controlled? She watched Preston Ashford, the heir apparent, loudly recount a sailing story to a circle of sycophants near the bar. He was already drunk, his laughter too loud, his movements careless. Isabella made a mental note. Incompetent. Volatile. Sterling Ashford brushed past her, his shoulder checking hers as he rushed to greet a minor celebrity. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look at her. To him, she was just background noise, perhaps a +1 or a well-dressed assistant. He had no idea that the silent woman in green held the pen that could sign his salvation or write his obituary. Isabella watched him go, her expression unreadable. The cage was indeed golden, she thought, but the birds inside were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. The string quartet played a sanitized waltz that floated over the hum of polite conversation, acting as a thin veneer over the tension gripping the room. Isabella Valori moved through the crowd like a ghost in emerald silk, her presence felt but unacknowledged. She had spent the last hour quietly auditing the Ashford family's soul, and what she found was hollow. She observed the way the servers flinched when Arabella raised a hand, and the way the guests' smiles didn't quite reach their eyes when Sterling boasted about future profits that didn't exist. She sought refuge near a towering arrangement of white hydrangeas, grateful for a moment of stillness. From this vantage point, she could see him, Preston Ashford. The heir to the empire she was currently deciding whether to save or bury. Preston was holding court near the open bar, surrounded by a phalanx of young men in identical tuxedos and women laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. He was handsome in the way spoiled things often are, polished on the surface, but with a softness around the jaw that spoke of a life without consequences. He swayed slightly, a glass of amber liquid sloshing dangerously in his hand. His laughter barked across the room, harsh and demanding, sucking the oxygen out of the immediate vicinity. Isabella watched him with cool detachment. She noted the flushed skin, the glassy sheen of his eyes. He was drunk, fueled by the manic energy of someone who believes the world exists solely for his amusement. Then, he saw her. It wasn't that she was looking at him, it was that she wasn't looking at him with the requisite adoration. In a room full of people desperate to be noticed by an Ashford, Isabella's indifference was a beacon. She was staring right through him, her expression one of clinical assessment rather than social submission. To a narcissist like Preston, whose ego was currently as fragile as his family's credit rating, her silence was an insult. He excused himself from his admirers, pushing off the bar with a little too much force. Isabella saw him coming, tracking his trajectory with the wariness one might reserve for a loose dog. She turned to leave, intending to slip toward the terrace, but Preston was quicker than his intoxication suggested. "Hey," he called out, his voice slurring slightly. "You." Isabella stopped but didn't turn immediately. She took a breath, composing her face into a mask of professional politeness. When she pivoted, Preston was closer than she expected, invading her personal space with the confidence of someone who has never been told no. The smell of expensive bourbon and stale arrogance wafted off him. "You're not drinking," Preston accused, gesturing vaguely at her water glass with his own tumbler. "It's a party. Or are you too good for my father's champagne?" "I'm working, Mr. Ashford," Isabella said, her voice smooth and low. She tried to step sideways, to put distance between them, but Preston mirrored her movement, blocking her path. "Working?" He squinted at her, his gaze raking over her green gown with a mixture of confusion and disdain. He couldn't place her. She wasn't a waitress, the dress cost more than his car, but she wasn't one of his social circle. That ambiguity annoyed him. He needed to categorize her so he could decide how to treat her, and her refusal to fit into a box was irritating his liquor-soaked brain. Working on what? Looking miserable. Observing, she corrected gently. "Please excuse me." She made to step around him again, but Preston planted a hand on the marble pillar behind her, effectively caging her in. The playfulness vanished from his face, replaced by a petulant sneer. He leaned in, looming over her, using his height as a weapon. "I didn't say you could leave," he muttered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, ugly whisper. "You know, everyone else here is dying to talk to me. Literally dying for 5 minutes of my time. And you're just standing here like you own the place." Isabella felt a flicker of heat in her chest, not fear, but the smoldering embers of the Valori temper she worked so hard to suppress. She looked up at him, her eyes dark and unyielding. Perhaps I simply value my time differently than they do. It was the wrong thing to say to a man who needed an ego boost. Preston's face darkened. The rejection stung him, sharp and immediate. He felt small, and Preston Ashford despised feeling small. He needed to reassert the natural order of things. He needed to remind this nobody that he was the sun, and she was just a planet meant to orbit him. You think you're better than me? He scoffed, his grip on his glass tightening until his knuckles turned white. The air between them grew heavy, charged with the static of impending violence. You're nobody. Just some stray my mother probably let in out of pity. Isabella didn't flinch. She stood her ground, trapped against the cold stone, watching the storm gather in his eyes. She realized then that he wasn't going to let her pass. He was going to make her pay for her silence. You look thirsty. The bottle didn't slip. Preston tipped it with the casual arrogance of a boy who had never cleaned a mess in his life. The sensation was immediate and shocking. The vintage Bordeaux, chilled to a perfect 55 degrees, hit Isabella's scalp like a physical blow. It wasn't just wet, it was heavy. The liquid cascaded down her forehead, stinging her eyes with acidity, blinding her in a curtain of dark red. It raced down her neck, icy and relentless, slipping beneath the bodice of her emerald gown to trace freezing rivulets down her spine. Isabella gasped, a sharp intake of breath that tasted of tannins and humiliation. The green silk, chosen carefully for its elegance, drank the wine greedily, turning a bruised, sickly black. The weight of the fabric increased instantly, clinging to her skin with a suffocating, sticky persistence. The ballroom fell into a silence so absolute it felt violent. The string quartet stopped mid-measure. The chatter died. There was only the sound of the wine dripping from her chin onto the floor, splat, 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 marking the seconds of her degradation. Isabella stood frozen, blinking against the sting, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. For a heartbeat, she waited for the apology. She waited for the gasp of horror, for someone to rush forward with a napkin, for the humanity that surely existed even in a room full of sharks. Then, a laugh cut through the silence like a shard of glass. Oh, look at that. Arabella Ashford's voice rang out, shrill and delighted. She wasn't rushing to help. She was holding up her phone, the screen glowing in the dim light. Do get a picture, Sterling. Her dress was ugly anyway, now it matches the decor. The cruelty was a physical slap. The matriarch, the woman who had greeted senators and bishops with a practiced smile, was cackling at a guest's ruin. Sterling Ashford stepped forward, but not to intervene. He peered at the puddle spreading around Isabella's heels with a look of mild annoyance. Classic Preston, he chuckled, as if his son had performed a clever parlor trick. He adjusted his cufflink, sneering at the mess. Do try not to drip on the imported marble, he murmured. This venue has standards. That was the signal. If the hosts were laughing, the cruelty was sanctioned. The hesitation in the room evaporated. The flashes began. First one, then a strobe light storm of white heat. Phones raised like weapons, lenses focusing on her stained face, her ruined dress, her isolation. Isabella felt the heat of the attention burning her cold skin. She felt the lenses dissecting her, stripping away her dignity to feed the insatiable hunger of a viral moment. She was no longer a person, she was content. She was a joke. The smell of the wine was overpowering now, cloying and sickening, mixing with the scent of expensive perfume and moral rot. Preston stood before her, grinning, the empty bottle dangling from his hand, waiting for her to cry, to run, to break. But amidst the flashing lights and the echoing laughter of the people she had come to save, Isabella felt something shift deep inside her chest. The cold wasn't just on her skin anymore. It was entering her veins, turning her blood to ice. The instinct to run was primal. It surged through Isabella's legs, a desperate, screaming need to flee the lights, the laughter, and the suffocating stench of the wine. Her chest heaved, fighting the sob that threatened to tear through her throat. Every part of her wanted to vanish, to sprint for the heavy oak doors and disappear into the night where the darkness could hide her shame. But she didn't move. She planted her heels into the imported marble, grounding herself. If she ran now, she was just a victim. If she ran now, she was just the girl in the ruined dress. Disrespect must always be answered. The voice in her head wasn't her own. It was low, gravelly, and terrifyingly calm. It was her father's voice. It was the lesson taught over dinner tables where business deals were sealed with handshakes and unspoken threats. It was the legacy she had spent a decade trying to outrun, only to find it was the only thing standing between her and total collapse. Isabella took a slow, jagged breath. The air tasted of tannins and betrayal. She lifted a hand, not to cover her face, but to clear her vision. With a deliberate, agonizingly slow motion, she wiped the wine from her eyes. Her mascara smeared, dark streaks mixing with the red Bordeaux, painting her face like a warrior preparing for a massacre. She straightened her spine. The movement was small, but it rippled through her body, snapping her posture from a cower into a command. She lifted her chin, defying the weight of the soaked silk, and locked her eyes onto Preston Ashford. Preston was still grinning, basking in the applause of his sycophants, waiting for the tears. He wanted the breakdown. He wanted the mascara-streaked sobbing plea for mercy. Instead, he got the abyss. Isabella stared at him. She didn't blink. She didn't scowl. Her face was a mask of terrifying, unnatural stillness. The darkness in her eyes wasn't the shallow anger of a humiliated guest. It was the ancient, cold fury of a predator that has just been woken up. It was the look of a woman who knows exactly where the bodies are buried because she knows who held the shovel. Preston's grin faltered. The change was subtle at first. A twitch at the corner of his mouth. A flicker of confusion in his glassy, drunk eyes. He looked around for his mother's approval, then back at Isabella, expecting her to have retreated. But she was still there. Still staring. The laughter around them began to sound distant, muffled by the roaring tension stretching between the two of them. Preston shifted his weight, his arrogance cracking under the weight of her silence. He felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, a primal warning bell ringing deep in his lizard brain. It was the instinct of a gazelle realizing the grass it was grazing on belonged to a lion. Isabella took one step forward. Preston instinctively took a step back. He didn't know why he did it. He was the rich kid. He was the heir. She was the one covered in wine. But the air around her had changed. It crackled with a dangerous electricity. She stepped into his personal space, ignoring the stench of his breath, ignoring the phone cameras still flashing in her periphery. She leaned in, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her dark irises, close enough that he could feel the radiating coldness of her soaking dress. The room seemed to vanish. There was only him, her, and the sudden, suffocating realization that he had miscalculated everything. "You," she whispered, her voice soft, devoid of tremor, slicing through the noise like a scalpel through dead flesh. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "You just made the most expensive mistake of your life." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. She pulled back, holding his gaze for 1 second longer, long enough to ensure the fear had taken root in his chest. And then she turned her face toward the doors. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She was waiting for the executioner. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom didn't just open, they were thrown wide with a force that rattled the crystal in the chandeliers. The sound was a dull, heavy boom that cut through the lingering murmurs of the crowd like a thunderclap. Heads turned, annoyance flickering on the faces of the elite, ready to sneer at a clumsy waiter or a late arrival. But the sneers died instantly, strangled in their throats. At the entrance, the Ashford Estate's private security team was retreating. They weren't escorting a guest, they were backing away, their faces pale, hands hovering uselessly near their belts as if they had encountered a force of nature they were not paid enough to challenge. Through the breach walked a phalanx of 4 men. They were massive, their movements synchronized and silent, wearing suits that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. They fanned out with military precision, securing the perimeter of the doorway, their eyes scanning the room not with curiosity, but with threat assessment. Then, the center parted. Alessandro Valori stepped into the light. If the Ashfords were peacocks, preening in their borrowed feathers and loud colors, Alessandro was a great white shark gliding into a koi pond. He was tall, his posture carrying the effortless, terrifying stillness of a man who has never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders like armor, cut sharp and severe. His silver-streaked hair was swept back, revealing a face carved from granite, hard angles, deep lines, and eyes that burned with a restrained, deadly intelligence. The atmosphere in the room didn't just shift, it evaporated. The air grew thin and cold. The champagne flutes stopped halfway to lips. The laughter that had filled the space moments ago felt like a distant, feverish dream, replaced by a suffocating dread. Even those who didn't know his name felt the sudden, primal urge to look at the floor. Alessandro paused at the top of the short staircase leading down to the dance floor. He didn't speak. He simply looked. His gaze swept over the room, a slow, methodical panning that weighed every soul present and found them wanting. Sterling Ashford, who had been busy laughing at the wine-soaked girl, felt his blood run cold. He grabbed Arabella's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "It's him," Sterling hissed, the color draining from his face until he looked like a corpse in a tuxedo. "The investor." Panic, sharp and acrid, flared in Sterling's chest. This was the man holding the pen to the $500 million check. This was the savior they had been praying for, the mysterious figure behind the Valori group who could erase their debts and save their legacy. And he had walked in on this. Sterling looked frantically from the terrifying figure at the door to the disaster unfolding in the center of the room. He looked at Preston, who was swaying drunkenly with a stupid, slack-jawed expression. He looked at the girl in the ruined green dress, standing amidst a puddle of wine and shattered glass. "Oh my God," Arabella whispered, shoving her phone into her clutch as if the device were suddenly radioactive. "The mess. Sterling, the mess. We have to clean it up before he sees." They didn't see a father coming for his daughter. They didn't see an executioner coming for a reckoning. They saw a business deal at risk. They saw a wealthy, powerful man, a man of standards, just like them, who would surely be disgusted by the sight of a clumsy, dirty nobody ruining their elegant party. "Get her out of here," Sterling barked at a nearby security guard, though he kept his voice low, terrified of drawing Alessandro's attention. "Get that trash out of sight. Now." But it was too late. Alessandro began to descend the stairs. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and inevitable. He ignored the waiters bowing nervously. He ignored the guests parting like the Red Sea before him. He didn't look at the Ashfords, who were frantically smoothing their clothes and fixing their smiles, preparing to beg. His eyes were locked on a single point in the center of the room. He was staring at the girl in green, and the fury radiating off him was hot enough to burn the estate to the ground. Sterling and Arabella Ashford moved with the frantic, terrified energy of scavengers spotting a lion. The moment they recognized the man in the charcoal suit, their arrogance evaporated, replaced by a desperate, sweating need to please. They smoothed their expensive clothes, fixed their frozen smiles, and rushed forward to intercept him before he could form an opinion of their chaotic party. They didn't walk toward him, they scurried. Isabella stood directly in their path, a statue of stained green silk and silence. She didn't move to let them pass. She didn't cower. She simply existed in the space they wanted to occupy. To Sterling, she was no longer a person. She was a stain on the carpet. She was an obstacle to the $500 million walking through the door. As he reached her, he didn't ask her to move. He didn't check to see if she was okay. With a look of pure, unadulterated annoyance, he stepped over the puddle of wine pooling at her feet, his polished shoe missing the hem of her ruined gown by inches. Arabella followed suit, gathering her skirts and swerving around Isabella with a grimace of distaste, as if the girl were a pile of broken glass that the maid had failed to sweep up. They physically erased her, treating the woman holding their fate like debris that needed to be cleared away. Mr. Valori. Sterling's breathless voice rang out, cracking slightly under the pressure. He extended a hand that was trembling despite his best efforts to still it. You made it. We are honor-bound by your presence. Alessandro Valori stopped. He didn't take the offered hand. He let Sterling's palm hang in the empty air, rejected and foolish. Alessandro's hands remained at his sides, still and heavy, his gaze looking right through Sterling as if the man were made of cellophane. Sterling swallowed hard, dropping his hand, his laugh nervous and high-pitched. Please, forgive the atmosphere. We had a minor incident. A distraction, Arabella chimed in, stepping up beside her husband. She flashed her teeth in a smile that looked like a rictus of panic. She gestured vaguely behind her, waving a manicured hand toward Isabella without actually looking at her. Just a clumsy girl. You know how it is with temporary staff. No coordination. She tripped and made a dreadful scene. The lie was smooth, practiced, and repulsive. They were rewriting the reality of their son's cruelty into a story of a servant's incompetence. They were blaming the victim while she was still standing there, dripping with the evidence of their son's assault. We were just having security remove her, Sterling added quickly, eager to pivot. He couldn't have this powerful investor looking at the mess. He needed him looking at the future. Please, ignore it. Ignore her. We have the VIP lounge prepared for you. He gestured eagerly toward a raised dais at the far end of the room, where a heavy mahogany table sat waiting. On it lay the merger agreement, bound in leather, a golden pen resting on top. It was their altar, and they were desperate to bring him to it. The contract is ready for your signature, sir, Sterling pressed, his eyes darting to the document that would save his life. The $500 million partnership. We can sign right now, seal the deal, and then enjoy a bottle of something, far better than what was spilled. Arabella reached out, attempting to gently touch Alessandro's arm to guide him, to usher him away from the girl in green and toward the money. Yes, please, this way, Mr. Valori. Let's get you away from this unpleasantness. We have standards to uphold, after all. They stood there, flanking him, grinning with desperate hope, pointing toward their salvation. They were so focused on the deal, so blinded by their own greed, that they failed to notice that Alessandro hadn't blinked. They failed to notice that the temperature around him had dropped to absolute zero. And they failed to notice that he wasn't looking at the contract, or at them, or at the VIP lounge. He was looking past them, over their shoulders, directly at the clumsy girl they had just stepped over. Sterling's hand hovered in the empty air, a bridge to nowhere. He waited for the firm grip of a savior, the handshake that would seal his salvation and erase his debts. Instead, he felt only the disturbance of the air as Alessandro Valori moved past him. It wasn't a snub, it was an erasure. Alessandro didn't step around them or excuse himself. He walked a straight line of terrifying purpose, forcing Sterling to stumble backward and Arabella to clutch to her chest to avoid being trampled by his sheer momentum. They watched, their frozen smiles faltering into confusion, as the billionaire investor strode toward the center of the room, toward the disaster they had tried so desperately to hide. Mr. Valori. Arabella called out, her voice thin and trembling. The VIP lounge is, the staff will handle the... Her voice died in her throat. Alessandro stopped inches from the girl in the ruined green dress. The distance between them was charged, heavy with a history the room couldn't comprehend. Isabella looked up at him, her mascara streaked, her hair matted with the sticky, expensive vintage. She didn't cower. She didn't cry. She stood with the stoic dignity of a soldier reporting for duty after a massacre. For a long, agonizing moment, Alessandro simply looked at her. The fury that had been radiating off him moments ago seemed to condense, focusing into a laser point of absolute, cold clarity. He looked at the wine dripping from her chin. He looked at the shivering tremor in her hands that she was fighting to suppress. He looked at the emptiness in the faces of the crowd that had watched this happen. Then, slowly, methodically, he unbuttoned his suit jacket. The movement was mesmerizing in its quiet power. He shrugged the charcoal wool from his shoulders, revealing a crisp white shirt and the dark gun holster that sat snug against his ribs, a detail that made several guests gasp audibly. But Alessandro didn't care about the gasps. He stepped forward and draped the jacket over Isabella's shoulders. The heavy fabric engulfed her, a warm, protective shell against the cold hostility of the room. It smelled of cedar, tobacco, and safety. Isabella pulled the lapels tight against her chest, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the only clean thing in her world. Alessandro reached out. His hand, known in the underworld for its iron grip and capacity for violence, was impossibly gentle. He extended a thumb and softly, tenderly wiped a smear of dark red wine from her cheekbone, careful not to bruise the skin. The intimacy of the gesture struck the room like a physical blow. This wasn't the way a man touched a stranger. This wasn't the way a boss touched an employee. "Are you hurt, Bellissima?" The Italian endearment hung in the silence, louder than a scream. "Bellissima. Most beautiful." Sterling Ashford felt the blood drain from his face so fast it left him dizzy. His heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He looked at the gun under the arm of the man he had tried to swindle. He looked at the girl he had treated like garbage. And then he looked at the eyes of the man wiping her face, eyes that held a love so fierce it promised annihilation to anyone who threatened it. The realization hit him with the force of a train wreck. The clumsy staff. The uninvited guest. The girl Preston had humiliated for sport. She wasn't nobody. She was the only thing in the world that mattered to the man holding the knife to Sterling's throat. Isabella leaned slightly into her father's touch, the mask of strength slipping just enough to reveal the daughter underneath. "No, Papa," she whispered, her voice rough but steady. "Just, disappointed." "Papa." The word echoed off the imported marble floors. Arabella Ashford covered her mouth with a trembling hand, a small whimper escaping her lips. Preston, standing a few feet away with the empty bottle still dangling from his fingers, turned the color of ash. The camera flashes had stopped. The laughter was a distant memory. There was only the cold, crushing weight of the truth, and the Ashfords stood frozen in it, realizing too late that they hadn't just spilled wine on a dress. They had spilled blood in the water. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the weight of a guillotine blade hanging suspended in the air. The ballroom, once alive with the clinking of crystal and the hum of gossip, was now a tomb. The only sound was the shallow, ragged breathing of Sterling Ashford, who looked as though his heart was trying to batter its way out of his ribcage. Isabella turned slowly, the oversized charcoal jacket swallowing her frame but lending her an aura of impenetrable authority. She looked at the family standing before her, the father who had stepped over her, the mother who had laughed at her, and the son who had poured the wine. They were no longer titans of industry or socialite queens. They were small, trembling things, shrinking under the shadow of the man standing behind her. We didn't know," Sterling stammered, his voice cracking. He held his hands out, palms up, in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Miss Valori, please. It was a misunderstanding. A joke gone wrong. We have the utmost respect for your father. For your family." "Respect?" Isabella repeated the word, tasting it like spoiled milk. She took a step toward them, her heels clicking sharply on the marble. You don't have respect, Mr. Ashford. You have fear. And there is a difference. She walked past him, moving toward the heavy mahogany table where the merger agreement lay waiting. The document was bound in blue leather, gold lettering glistening under the chandelier light. It was the Ashford legacy. It was their salvation. It was $500 million of unearned grace. Isabella ran a hand over the cover. Her fingers were still sticky with wine, leaving a faint, dark smear on the pristine leather. Sterling watched the movement, his eyes widening in horror, but he didn't dare move. He didn't dare breathe. You invited the Valori group into your home because you needed a silent partner, Isabella said, her voice carrying to the corners of the room. You needed someone to bail out your bad investments and cover your debts. You thought you were getting a checkbook. She picked up the heavy document. It felt significant in her hands, the weight of a life, or the end of one. My father is the chairman, she continued, turning back to face them. But he doesn't handle the financials. He doesn't vet the partners. He leaves that to the chief financial officer. Isabella paused, letting the title hang in the air. She saw the confusion in Arabella's eyes shift to dawning horror. I am the CFO of the Valori Group, Isabella said softly. I was sent here tonight to answer one question, is the Ashford legacy worth saving? She looked at Preston. The air was trembling now, the alcohol purged from his system by pure adrenaline. He looked young, foolish, and terrified. He looked at the contract in her hands like a drowning man looking at a life raft. Isabella held his gaze. She didn't shout. She didn't scream. She simply let him see the green stain on her chest, the ruin he had caused for a laugh. You poured wine on the person holding your mortgage, she whispered. With a sudden, violent motion, Isabella gripped the thick document with both hands. She didn't just tear it, she destroyed it. The sound of the heavy paper ripping was shockingly loud, a dry, tearing screech that echoed like a breaking bone. Sterling let out a strangled cry, stepping forward instinctively, but a single glare from Alessandro froze him in place. Isabella ripped it again. And again. She tore through the signatures, through the clauses, through the $500 million promise. She let the pieces flutter from her hands, raining down onto the puddle of wine at her feet, a confetti of ruin. Consider the wedding, Isabella said, her voice cold and final as she looked at the debris of their future soaking into the floor. And your credit line, cancelled. The sound of the torn contract hitting the floor was softer than a whisper, yet it struck Sterling Ashford with the force of a wrecking ball. He stared at the shredded remains of his salvation, blue leather and gold leaf now indistinguishable from the trash, and felt his knees buckle. The $500 million was gone. The lifeline was severed. The water was rushing in. No, Sterling croaked, lurching forward, his hands grasping at the empty air where the document had been. No, you can't. Mr. Valori, please. We can fix this. I can make him apologize. I'll make him crawl. He spun toward Preston, who stood paralyzed near the pillar, his face the color of old ash. Apologize. Sterling screamed, his voice cracking into a hysterical shriek. Get on your knees and apologize to her right now, you stupid, useless boy. Preston flinched as if struck, but before he could move, Alessandro Valori stepped between them. The movement was slight, just a shift of weight, but it created an impenetrable wall between the Ashfords and any hope of redemption. Alessandro looked down at Sterling, who was now weeping openly, his dignity puddle deep and evaporating fast. Save your breath, Mr. Ashford, Alessandro said. His voice was terrifyingly low, a rumble of thunder that vibrated in the floorboards. The time for negotiation ended when your son decided my daughter was a prop for his amusement. Sterling looked up, tears cutting tracks through his pancake makeup. Please, he begged, clutching at Alessandro's sleeve before realizing his mistake and recoiling. You can't do this. You'll destroy us. We'll lose everything. The estate, the company, will be ruined. Alessandro leaned in. The distance between them closed until Sterling could smell the faint, metallic scent of gun oil beneath the expensive cologne. Ruined? Alessandro repeated the word, tasting it. He shook his head slowly. You misunderstand the nature of the gift I have just given you. He gestured to the room, to the terrified guests, to the opulence that smelled of rot. If I had treated you the way a man in my position usually treats those who touch his family, Alessandro whispered, his eyes dark and dead, there would be no estate left to seize. There would be no company to bankrupt. And there would be no son left to disappoint you. Sterling stopped breathing. The threat hung in the air, explicit and horrifying. You are lucky, Alessandro continued, straightening his cuffs. I am letting you keep your lives. You will simply have to live them poor. He paused, his gaze sweeping over Arabella and Preston with icy finality. I suggest you learn to budget. I hear the winters are cold when you cannot afford the heating. He turned his back on them. It was the ultimate dismissal. He offered his arm to Isabella, who stood tall amidst the wreckage, the oversized charcoal jacket wrapped around her like a mantle of victory. Come, Bellissima, Alessandro said, his voice softening instantly as he looked at his daughter. The air in here is cheap. Isabella took his arm. She didn't look back. She didn't need to see the devastation to know it was there. They walked toward the exit, the sea of guests parting frantically to let them pass. No one spoke. No one breathed. They were witnessing the departure of gods, leaving the mortals to burn. As the heavy oak doors boomed shut behind the Valori family, the spell broke. The silence shattered into chaos. Arabella Ashford turned on her husband, her face twisted into a mask of pure, venomous hatred. You idiot, she screamed, shoving Sterling so hard he stumbled into a waiter. You said you had it handled. You said he was a partner. Me? Sterling roared back, his veins bulging in his neck. You're the one who laughed. You're the one who filmed it. You encouraged him. I was being a host. Arabella shrieked, tearing at her diamond necklace as if it were strangling her. You let our son destroy us. You let him drink himself stupid and insult the only money left in the city. They descended into a frenzy of blame, screaming accusations over the ruins of their gala. The guests began to flee, rushing for the exits like rats abandoning a sinking ship, desperate to distance themselves from the stench of failure. In the center of the storm stood Preston. He was alone. The sycophants were gone. The friends were gone. He looked down at his hand, where his phone had been buzzing relentlessly against his palm. He lifted it slowly, the screen glowing bright in the dimming hall. Notification, Ashford Holdings, stock crash. Trading halted. Notification, First National Bank. Account freeze alert, suspicious activity. Notification, Amex Platinum. Card declined. Notification, Valori Group. Merger terminated. The buzz was constant, a swarm of digital hornets stinging him over and over again. BZZZT, BZZZT, BZZZT. He watched the notifications stack up, one after another, burying his future in real time. Around him, his parents' screams reached a fever pitch, echoing off the imported marble and the crystal chandeliers, sounding less like human voices and more like the howling of ghosts in a graveyard of their own making. Preston stared at the screen until it went black. Then, he simply dropped it. It hit the floor and cracked, landing right next to the puddle of wine. Isabella didn't just cancel a contract, she canceled their entire future with a single tear of paper. They laughed at her silence, but now they are left screaming in the ruins of their own arrogance. Do you think $500 million was a fair price to pay for that glass of wine, or did they get off easy? Let me know your verdict in the comments, and make sure to subscribe if you believe disrespect should always be answered. I read every single one comments. Please smash that subscribe button and hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible story. Also leave your comments.